An ordinary skier descended the slope, but his fall led to an incredible discovery. Hidden under the snow was a huge iron door, walled up directly into the mountain. He decided to open it and immediately dialed 911. What they found inside forced everyone to evacuate the entire area. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to share this video with your friends. The mountains had always called to him, though he had never fully understood why. Perhaps it was the silence, the way the air at high altitude seemed stripped of every unnecessary sound, or perhaps it was the challenge of confronting nature in its most untamed form. For Jerome Wallace, a man in his early 40s whose life had been a long series of battles with monotony, disappointment, and the expectations of others, the Alps represented something he desperately needed, but rarely found: freedom. He had not come here to prove himself to anyone. He had no trophies to win, no spectators waiting at the bottom of the slope to applaud his speed. He had come simply to escape. Back in the city, his days blended together into a colorless blur. He worked, he ate, he slept, and in between he felt himself shrinking. Once, years ago, he had been a promising athlete. Skiing had been his passion, the one thing that lit a fire in him and drew admiration from strangers. But careers fade, bodies slow down, and responsibilities pile up until even passion seems like a luxury. Jerome had accepted that he was no longer the man people once cheered for. Yet, there was still that pull, that whisper inside him that urged him to keep moving, to keep seeking the rush of cold wind across his face, the sense of flight as he cut across the snow. When he arrived in the Alps, he avoided the packed resorts with their buzzing crowds and neon-lit après ski bars. He did not need company. What he craved was solitude, the kind that could only be found where the mountains stood guard like ancient sentinels, aloof and silent. That morning, after strapping on his skis, he turned away from the marked trails and made his way higher, searching for an untouched slope. The air was sharp and crisp, each breath a clean slice through his lungs. He could feel the sun trying to pierce through the veil of thin clouds, throwing pale glimmers across the endless snowfields. The descent began smoothly. He leaned into the slope, letting his body remember what it had once known so well. Every muscle responded with precision, every movement balanced between control and surrender. The snow hissed under his skis, spraying in fine arcs behind him. For a few precious minutes, he felt younger, as if time had reversed and the world had stripped him of its weight. The city seemed far away, irrelevant, erased. Here there was only him, the mountain, and the sky. But solitude has its dangers. With no one to follow and no marked route to guide him, Jerome was fully at the mercy of the mountain. The slope beneath him, smooth at first, turned treacherous. A layer of ice hid just beneath the powder, and his ski caught against it. The world tilted violently as his balance vanished. In a blur of snow and panic, he was thrown to the ground. The impact jarred through his bones, his skis twisting awkwardly as he tumbled. Snow filled his mouth, clogged his nostrils, burned against his exposed skin as he rolled uncontrollably down the incline. He slid for what felt like forever before his body finally slammed to a stop. His heart thundered as he tried to push himself up, coughing snow from his throat. His goggles were askew, his breath ragged. For a moment, he simply sat there, shaken, staring at the slope he had just fallen down. Then he realized that his body had collided with something unusual, something solid that did not belong to the mountain at all. Beneath his gloved hands, the texture was strange, not rock nor ice, but cold and unyielding in a different way. Curiosity overcame disorientation. He brushed away the snow, revealing a surface that gleamed faintly in the pale light. Metal, wide, flat, and smooth. His first thought was of a buried ski lift mechanism, some forgotten equipment left by mountaineers decades ago. But as he scraped more snow aside, the shape grew clearer, broader, more deliberate. He realized he was uncovering a flat panel, its edges too precise, too engineered to be a fragment of machinery. The more he cleared, the more certain he became. It was not a fragment at all, but the face of a structure. Jerome knelt, ignoring the cold that seeped through his clothes, and dug with both hands. The snow crumbled and slid away until at last a large outline emerged, a rectangular form anchored firmly into the side of the mountain. He stepped back, breath rising in foggy bursts, his mind racing. What he saw was unmistakable. It was a door. It stood massive and silent, recessed into a concrete frame that jutted out slightly from the rock face. Rust streaked the surface like dried blood, and the hinges were swollen with decades of corrosion. The paint, once bright, was now little more than faded patches clinging stubbornly to the metal. Even so, he could make out the faint traces of markings, symbols, perhaps, or words that had nearly vanished under the punishment of time. Jerome felt his skin prickle. He had expected the mountain to give him peace, maybe adventure, but not this. Not something man-made hidden at this altitude, waiting to be uncovered by accident. The silence around him pressed heavier now, as though the peaks themselves disapproved of his discovery. He looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone else approaching, though he knew he was alone. For a moment, he considered leaving it, burying the strange door again beneath snow, and convincing himself it had never existed. Yet the thought of walking away gnawed at him. Why was it here? Who had built it, and what lay behind it? His heart pounded, torn between caution and curiosity. He had come here searching for solitude, but the mountain had given him a mystery instead. As the wind howled across the peaks and the sky darkened with drifting clouds, Jerome found himself standing before that door, breath quickening, eyes locked on the rusted surface. He knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary accident of history. Something waited behind it, something forgotten, and perhaps something dangerous. And though every instinct warned him to turn away, he could not. The silence stretched, broken only by the moan of the wind. His hand reached out almost against his will, brushing the frigid metal. The cold bit through his glove, anchoring him to the reality of the moment. He whispered nothing, asked no questions aloud, but in his mind, the decision was already forming. He would not walk away. He would return to this door, and he would find out what it hid. And with that silent promise, Jerome stood there in the snow, the mountains looming around him, the strange metallic outline glinting faintly beneath the clouds. What had begun as a simple descent, an escape into the purity of winter, had become the beginning of something far greater, and perhaps far more perilous than he could have imagined. The path into the mountains had led him not only into solitude, but into the grip of a secret buried in ice and stone. The wind howled across the jagged ridges as Jerome stood frozen before the discovery he had unearthed, his breath misting in the frigid air, his gloved hand still resting on the frozen slab of metal. The fall that had left him bruised and gasping now seemed a minor incident compared to the revelation that loomed before him. This was not some fragment of machinery or a discarded relic of mountaineers. It was a door, massive and deliberate, sealed into the mountain itself, as though the peaks had been sculpted around it. The raw truth of that realization pressed down on him with a weight heavier than the snow-laden sky. He traced the edges with his eyes, noting how seamlessly the concrete frame fused into the surrounding rock. Whoever had built this had done so with intention, not haste. The hinges, swollen with rust, were thick enough to hold back unimaginable force. Patches of paint still clung desperately to the metal surface, but their original color was impossible to determine. Perhaps red, perhaps black, perhaps some military shade of olive green long since faded by decades of wind and ice. And there were markings, faint, eroded by time, their meaning swallowed by years of storms. At first glance they resembled symbols, but as he squinted closer, he thought he saw the ghost of letters, though none were clear enough to read. The silence surrounding him deepened. It was no longer the peaceful hush of an untouched alpine slope, but the heavy quiet of a place that seemed to demand reverence. The mountains, which moments before had felt like allies in his pursuit of solitude, now seemed like solemn witnesses to a trespass. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, torn between awe and dread. There was a part of him that wanted to turn away, to bury the thing under fresh snow, to pretend the discovery had never happened. Yet another part, stronger and insistent, urged him to press forward. He took a step back, his boots crunching into the packed snow, and circled the entrance with slow caution. The door's edges were firmly locked into the mountainside, as though carved into it by force. He placed his palm against the surface again. The metal was so cold it seemed to bite through the fabric of his glove. Beneath his touch, the structure felt unyielding, as if it had stood for generations, waiting, refusing to reveal its secrets. A swirl of wind blew loose snow into his face, and for a moment he considered how absurd it all was. He had come here to ski, to find a measure of release from the ordinary burdens of life. He had not come seeking ruins, secrets, or mysteries. Yet the mountain had chosen him, it seemed, pulling him into a story that reached far beyond recreation. He was alone up here, but the presence of the door made him feel less alone than ever. Something lay behind it, hidden, intentional, and the very thought gnawed at his curiosity like an itch he could not ignore. His imagination began to race. What could it be? Perhaps an emergency shelter built during the Cold War, long forgotten by the world, or a scientific outpost abandoned when the weather grew too harsh, left to freeze into obscurity, or something far older, a remnant of wars that had scarred entire continents. The Alps had seen centuries of conflict, and it was not impossible to believe that someone had carved a secret place into their heart. The idea both fascinated and unnerved him. If it was military in origin, it might still harbor things better left untouched. The weight of his solitude pressed harder now. If he made the wrong choice, there would be no one to help him. No one knew he was here. No one expected him on this slope, and no one could guess that a door waited at this altitude. For long moments, he simply stood, staring, the struggle playing out silently within him. He thought of the stories he had heard as a child, of travelers stumbling upon things buried by time, of discoveries that brought as much danger as wonder. He wondered if this was one of those moments. But curiosity is a relentless force, and Jerome was a man who had always been driven by the desire to know, to see, to push past the edges of what was comfortable. He shifted his weight, adjusted his gloves, and pressed his shoulder against the door. At first, it did not move. The hinges groaned faintly but held firm, as though resisting intrusion. He stepped back, studied the surface again, and tried once more, this time with greater force. The sound that followed was unlike anything he had ever heard in such silence, a long, metallic screech that seemed to split the mountain itself. The echo rolled into the valleys, a harsh cry of rusted iron yielding after decades of stubbornness. The door shifted slightly, opening just enough to reveal a black slit between the frame and the mountain's interior. From that darkness came a rush of air, stale and damp, carrying with it the faintest odor of rot and forgotten stone. Jerome stumbled back instinctively, his pulse quickening. The smell was not of fresh earth or ice, but of something confined for too long. It was as though the mountain had exhaled a breath it had held for half a century. He steadied himself, his breath visible in the cold, and stared at the narrow opening. The blackness beyond seemed absolute, a void that swallowed the light around it. The idea of stepping inside unsettled him, but at the same time, he could not pull his gaze away. He could almost feel the passage calling to him, whispering in silence that he had come too far to turn back now. The snow continued to drift, the peaks loomed unchanged, and yet everything felt different. The world outside the door remained the same, but Jerome knew that with one step into that darkness, nothing would ever be the same again for him. He had crossed from the familiar into the unknown. He told himself he could leave, that he could turn away, ski back down, and forget this place. Yet even as he thought it, he knew the truth. The door had already taken hold of him. He braced himself and pushed harder. The rusted hinges shrieked louder this time, flakes of corrosion falling like red snow onto the ground. The gap widened until there was space enough to slip through. A cold draft poured out, damp and heavy, brushing against his face. The scent of ancient stone, metal, and mildew enveloped him, mingling with the sharp purity of alpine air in a strange, unsettling contrast. He tightened the strap of his goggles, adjusted the lamp he carried in his pocket, and stood at the threshold. Behind him stretched the open slopes, white and bright, a landscape of freedom. Ahead of him yawned the corridor, dark and endless, its secrets locked away by decades of silence. He hesitated one last time, the battle between caution and curiosity raging inside him. The door was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a gateway, and whatever it led to, it was now part of his story. With one final glance at the pale sky and the vast expanse of snow, Jerome leaned forward and stepped into the shadow, leaving the mountain's light behind. The darkness enveloped him instantly, thick and suffocating, as though the door had closed not just on the world outside, but on everything he had been before. He had crossed into something ancient, something hidden, and the mountain would never again be the same. The moment Jerome crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted so completely that it felt as though he had passed into another world. Behind him, the mountains remained radiant in their frozen silence, a canvas of blinding white under a pale sky. But within a few steps, all of that vanished. The light from outside dimmed to a faint glow at his back, then disappeared entirely as the heavy door settled against its frame with a groan of protest. Ahead of him stretched a corridor, long and narrow, its edges swallowed by shadows. He fumbled for the small headlamp clipped to his jacket, thankful that habit had made him carry it, even though he had not planned to ski at dusk. With a click, a weak beam cut through the blackness, casting narrow cones of light along the walls and floor. The corridor was narrower than he expected, a tight passage carved into concrete, the ceiling just high enough for him to stand without crouching. His footsteps echoed in uneven rhythms, sharp against the concrete floor, then distorted as the sound bounced through the chamber. It was cold, colder even than the slopes outside, but in a different way. It was not the clean, bracing cold of alpine air, but a damp chill that clung to his skin and seemed to seep through his clothes. The walls were streaked with water stains, rivulets frozen into jagged threads of ice. Somewhere in the distance, a slow drip echoed at irregular intervals, a steady reminder that time had been eroding this place long before he arrived. The air itself tasted strange. There was metal in it, a tang of rust mixed with the musty rot of mildew. It carried the weight of confinement, as though the mountain had been hoarding these smells for decades, reluctant to release them until now. Jerome wrinkled his nose but pressed forward, his heart pounding, the weight of each breath heavier than the last. His light flickered across the walls and revealed cracks where mold had taken root, dark streaks branching out like veins. As he ventured deeper, his beam landed on something that made him pause. Against one wall, half buried under a pile of rubble, lay what appeared to be equipment. Old, rusted, its purpose difficult to decipher. He crouched closer, brushing away debris with his glove. The shape resolved into a collapsed generator, its casing torn and wires spilling out like veins of copper. Nearby, smaller fragments littered the floor. Broken glass, twisted pipes, and shards of metal that might once have been tools. This was no natural cave. It was a constructed space designed with purpose, filled once with machinery that had long since decayed. In another corner of the room, he noticed the remnants of something even more human, scraps of fabric that had once been clothing, now brittle and darkened with age. A torn sleeve with faint stitching clung to the floor as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. A helmet, dented and speckled with rust, leaned against the wall. For a moment, Jerome's breath caught as the implications pressed down on him. Someone had been here, decades ago, perhaps many people, and their lives had intersected with this space in ways he could only guess at. He stood still, listening, his heart loud in his ears. It was impossible not to imagine voices echoing off these walls, footsteps long vanished, the clatter of tools and orders barked in languages that time had erased. The silence felt too complete, as if it had swallowed those sounds but still held their memory. He pressed on, though each step seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the unseen history embedded in the concrete. The corridor stretched on, branching at times into smaller passageways that gaped like open mouths. Most were blocked by fallen debris, but one remained passable, and Jerome followed it cautiously. The narrow beam of his lamp revealed more signs of human presence. Rusted pipes running along the ceiling, valves corroded shut, and faded signs stenciled onto the walls in paint that had peeled away until only fragments remained. He could not read them, but their style was unmistakably military. The thought chilled him. At last the corridor opened into a larger chamber. Jerome stopped at the threshold, his light sweeping across a space that must once have been a central hub. The ceiling rose higher here, though parts of it sagged under the weight of stone and ice. The floor was littered with broken furniture. Tables splintered into heaps, chairs overturned and rusted into shapes that looked almost skeletal. In the center of the room lay a cluster of crates stacked haphazardly. Some collapsed, others intact but covered with a thick blanket of frost. He approached slowly, brushing ice away from the surface of one crate. Underneath, faint black letters emerged, their meaning obscured by decades of wear, but the numbers, stark and precise, were still visible. His chest tightened. He didn't know exactly what they signified, but the deliberate markings told him this was inventory, not debris. Whoever had been here had stored things carefully, counted them, and left them waiting in silence. The thought unsettled him more deeply than the collapse of the furniture or the dripping ceilings. Furniture could decay and be forgotten, but supplies meant intent. This place had been built for a purpose, and that purpose had not been casual. Jerome backed away slightly, his breath quickening. He swung the beam of his lamp across the room again, and this time it caught on another detail, a line of faded posters clinging stubbornly to one wall. Their edges curled and torn, but he could make out silhouettes of soldiers, planes, and bold letters in a language he could not understand. The artwork was old-fashioned, unmistakably propaganda from another era. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing, and the truth began to settle over him like the cold damp that clung to the air. This was no shelter for skiers, no scientific outpost abandoned to the weather. This was something older, something tied to the machinery of war. The realization made his skin prickle. He stepped back into the middle of the chamber, his light wavering across the collapsed crates and broken tables, and tried to steady his breathing. He was deep inside a structure built for reasons he could not yet grasp, and with every step he took, he was being drawn further from the safety of the mountain's light. The silence, once comforting in its purity, now felt oppressive. It was no longer the stillness of untouched snow, but the silence of things deliberately buried, sealed away. Yet he continued forward, because retreat felt impossible. The door had opened, and with it his curiosity had been unleashed. He knew he could still turn back, push his way into the daylight, and leave this place to its secrets. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was a lie. Something here demanded to be uncovered, and he was already in too deep. The corridor at the far end of the chamber beckoned him, its mouth dark and waiting. He hesitated, drawing one long breath, and then began to walk again, the beam of his lamp cutting into the shadows. Behind him, the chamber settled into silence once more, the drip of water echoing faintly, as if the mountain itself was marking the rhythm of his intrusion. Ahead, the darkness thickened, promising revelations he was not sure he wanted, but could no longer refuse. Jerome moved deeper into the structure, his breath loud beneath the hood of his jacket, the lamp beam shaking slightly in his unsteady hand. The corridor stretched longer than he expected, bending in subtle angles that made him feel as though the mountain were swallowing him whole. He glanced back once, instinct urging him to confirm that the way out was still there, but the door was far behind, reduced now to a memory. Darkness closed in from all sides, pressing at him as if the mountain disapproved of his presence. Yet forward he went, pulled by that same insistent curiosity that had led him here in the first place. The narrow passage opened suddenly into a new chamber, and Jerome froze at the threshold. The room was larger than the first, more intact, and though time had scarred it, there was no mistaking its function. Along the walls, rows of shelves sagged under the weight of rotting binders and wooden boxes, their edges softened by mold. Paper lay scattered across the floor in brittle sheets that crumbled when the cold draft shifted. Against one wall stood a rusted cabinet, its doors crooked on their hinges, revealing stacks of folders swollen with damp. He stepped closer, raising his light, and saw writing etched in neat black script across their spines. The letters were foreign, blocky, and though faded, they were still legible enough to betray their origin. He did not need to know the language to understand the weight of what he was seeing. These were records, archives. He crouched and lifted one of the folders from the cabinet, surprised at how fragile it felt, as though it might dissolve in his hands. The paper inside was brittle and yellowed, corners curled, ink bleeding in places from years of exposure to moisture. Diagrams filled the pages, crude sketches of terrain, outlines of buildings, lists written in precise columns. On one page he saw the outline of a mountain plateau marked with runways and arrows. His heart thudded louder as realization settled over him. Whoever had built this place had not intended it as a simple shelter. It had been part of something vast, something that extended beyond this single hidden door. He set the folder down and turned his light across the room again. On the floor, half buried beneath torn binders, lay another sheet of paper, more intact than the rest. He lifted it carefully, his gloved fingers brushing away dirt, and froze when he saw what it contained. It was a map, the mountains outlined with stark precision, valleys and ridges drawn in thin black lines. Certain areas had been circled, symbols scrawled in bold across them. At the center was a mark. This mountain, this very slope, indicated not as an empty peak, but as a storage site. The map was dated, the year smudged but recognizable as from a time when the world had burned in war. Jerome's throat tightened. He was standing in a relic of that fire, a remnant deliberately buried but never forgotten by the mountain that concealed it. The realization filled him with a strange mix of awe and dread. He had stumbled not into a curiosity, but into history itself, preserved in darkness. Every paper he touched whispered of decisions made by hands long dead, of plans executed in secrecy, of lives lost and lives endangered. He felt like an intruder, trespassing not just against stone and concrete, but against time. He placed the map back where he had found it, uneasy at disturbing even a single artifact. His lamp caught movement. No, not movement, but the illusion of it, as light flickered across the edges of posters hanging stubbornly on the walls. He stepped closer. These were larger than the fragments he had seen earlier. Despite peeling corners and mold creeping along their surfaces, the images were clear enough to recognize. Soldiers marched across one, their uniforms stark and severe. On another, a plane soared above jagged peaks, painted with triumphant strokes meant to inspire confidence. Bold words shouted from the posters, their meanings obscured by language, but the tone unmistakable. Propaganda. Encouragement for those who once worked and lived in this underground fortress. The discovery made his chest constrict. This place was not abandoned by accident. It had been part of something deliberate, a gear in a war machine that spanned nations. He moved again, his boots crunching against layers of paper underfoot, and entered another corridor branching from the archive. This passage felt different, narrower, the air heavier. Pipes ran along the ceiling, their rusted surfaces dripping with condensation that plinked rhythmically into puddles below. The sound echoed in the silence, sharp and hollow, reminding him that the mountain itself was always shifting, always reclaiming. He followed the pipes, his lamp flickering across the damp concrete, until he reached another door. This one was smaller than the massive exterior slab, but no less foreboding. He placed his hand against it and felt cold seep into his bones. With effort, he shoved it open, and it screeched reluctantly, revealing another room. Inside, the space was lined with metal racks. Many had collapsed under the weight of time, but a few still stood, holding remnants of supplies. Tin containers stacked neatly, though corroded, their labels peeling. Glass bottles clouded with age. Wooden crates sealed with metal straps, their contents still hidden but their purpose clear enough. This was a storage chamber. Jerome felt a rush of unease as he realized how methodical it all was. This place had not been thrown together in haste, but built with planning, discipline, and intent to endure. He crouched by one of the crates, brushing frost from its surface. Stenciled markings stared back at him, black and severe, their language foreign, but their meaning suggested by context. Numbers, codes, identifiers of what was inside. He dared not pry the crate open, his instincts warning him against disturbing what lay within. But the conclusion was inescapable. This had been a military stockpile. Ammunition, weapons, perhaps even more dangerous things, all hidden away and forgotten. The thought sent a shiver through him, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what he was uncovering. Standing in the dim light of his lamp, Jerome felt the air thicken around him. The silence pressed closer, as though the mountain itself had ears, as though the ghosts of those who once walked these corridors were aware of his trespass. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that he was alone, that time had swept all of them away. But as his eyes swept the room again, lingering on the crates and racks, on the propaganda still clinging to the walls, he knew he was standing inside a chapter of history that had been meant to remain closed. He forced himself to move, to retrace his steps back into the main corridor. The papers still littered the floor, whispering beneath his boots as though protesting his intrusion. The shelves seemed to loom higher now, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. He turned his lamp ahead, following the corridor further still, the path sloping downward into yet more darkness. The mountain was pulling him deeper, and though dread gnawed at his resolve, he knew he would not turn back. He could not unsee what he had already discovered, could not pretend ignorance. Each step became a pact, carrying him further into a place that was no longer simply a ruin, but a vault of secrets. And as he descended, Jerome realized that this journey was not just about discovery, but about confrontation. With the past, with dangers long buried, and with the question of what should remain hidden and what should finally come into the light. The mountain had held its silence for decades, but he had broken it. Now he had no choice but to hear what it had to say. The corridor sloped downward, pulling Jerome into the belly of the mountain, as though gravity itself had chosen his path. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with a dampness that clung to his lungs and slowed his breathing. His lamp carved a narrow tunnel of light through the dark, and every flicker of its beam seemed to reveal more signs of careful construction. The walls here were smoother, reinforced with slabs of concrete rather than the rough mixture of stone and mold he had seen earlier. Steel bolts protruded in places, eaten by rust but still strong enough to hold the structure together even after decades of neglect. This was no temporary hideaway. This was a fortress, carved into stone with the intention of permanence. As he walked, the sound of his boots echoed strangely, louder now, almost distorted. The silence pressed harder with each footfall until he felt as if unseen eyes were following his every move. He tried not to think of the men who had once marched these corridors, their boots striking in unison, their voices bouncing off the walls in languages he could not understand. But imagination is relentless, and in his mind he heard them, a ghostly echo of discipline and war, reminding him he was trespassing in a place that had not been meant to be rediscovered. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a vast chamber so large that Jerome's lamp could not illuminate its full extent. He stopped, his breath catching, and raised the beam higher. Rows of massive crates stretched into the shadows, stacked neatly like silent sentinels. Their wooden surfaces were weathered but intact, their metal bands streaked with corrosion yet still clinging tightly. Stenciled letters marked their sides, black and bold against the faded wood. The sight made his skin prickle. He had no doubt what these were, though his rational mind fought against accepting it. He stepped closer, brushing frost away with his glove until the markings revealed themselves more clearly. Numbers, codes, symbols repeated across crate after crate, their meaning unfamiliar but their purpose unmistakable. These were inventories, meticulously labeled, carefully placed. The scale of it left him reeling. There were not a few crates scattered here and there, but hundreds, perhaps more, stretching into the blackness of the hall. His chest tightened as he thought of what might be inside. Ammunition, explosives, weapons that had been designed to kill on battlefields that no longer existed. He pressed his ear to one of the crates as though expecting to hear something within, but all he felt was the steady pulse of his own blood pounding in fear. He stepped back, his lamp sweeping across the chamber again. Now he saw more details. Racks of metal cylinders leaning against the far wall, their surfaces coated in rust and ice. Some had toppled over, lying crooked and fragile. A pungent smell, faint but distinct, hung in the air, the unmistakable scent of gunpowder and decay. Jerome's breath quickened. He was standing inside a bomb. The realization struck with a force that made his knees weaken. If even one of these ancient weapons were unstable enough to detonate, the mountain could become a tomb not only for him, but for anyone living in the valleys below. He staggered back a few steps, fighting the urge to flee immediately. Yet his curiosity anchored him. He forced himself to look again, to see the full horror of what had been hidden here. On one side of the chamber, partially obscured by fallen beams, a smaller group of crates had split open. Their contents spilled into the dust. Rows of shells, dull with corrosion, but unmistakably deadly. Some were cracked, their metal peeling like old bark. He crouched closer, unable to resist the grim magnetism of the sight, and saw strange stains spreading from the ruptured cases onto the floor, frozen in ugly patterns. His lamp reflected off the warped surfaces, and he felt nausea twist in his stomach. These were not harmless relics. These were live, dangerous remains of a war that had been buried but not erased. He stood quickly, his breath ragged, and swung the light across the chamber once more. There were more. So many more. An arsenal waiting silently in the cold. Whoever had built this place had intended it as a reserve, a hidden stockpile of destruction, ready to be unleashed should the world demand it. But the war had ended, and time had forgotten. Only the mountain had remembered, keeping the arsenal sealed away, waiting for someone reckless enough to uncover it. That someone was him. Fear crawled along his spine, sharper now, almost unbearable. He wanted to run, to turn and retrace every step until he reached the open air and the reassuring brightness of snow. Yet his legs would not move. He stood frozen, staring at the sheer scale of what surrounded him. His mind spun with questions. Who had ordered this? How many people had labored to carry these weapons into the mountain? Why had no one dismantled it when the war ended? The answers lay somewhere in the archives he had passed, in the propaganda still clinging to the walls, in the maps he had glimpsed, but the weight of them pressed in on him now with suffocating force. Jerome backed away toward the entrance of the chamber, careful not to stumble, careful not to disturb even a mote of dust. Every breath felt dangerous, every sound amplified in the cavernous space. the smell of rust and decay clung to his clothes as though marking him with the stench of history. He told himself he had seen enough, more than enough. To remain here longer was to flirt with catastrophe. Yet, even as he thought this, he felt the same tug of fascination, the same hunger to understand. He turned his light back one last time, letting it sweep slowly across the chamber. Crates stretched into the distance, shadows swallowing their ends, their silent presence a warning and a threat. The mountain had hidden this arsenal for decades, but it had not destroyed it. Time had not neutralized it. Instead, it had preserved the weapons in a state of fragile, dangerous sleep. Jerome was the intruder who had stumbled into their grave, and he felt the certainty that he was not meant to be here. The urge to leave became irresistible. He steadied himself, took one final look at the deadly silence around him, and turned back into the corridor. His lamp trembled in his grip as he retraced his steps, the thought of the massive door at the surface now his only anchor. Behind him, the chamber lingered in his mind, vast and full of menace, a reminder that the past never truly disappears. It waits, patient and silent, for the day someone like him stumbles into its depths. But as he walked, the unease in his chest only deepened. For the first time since he had entered the mountain, he realized that he might not be walking back to safety. He might already be too close to catastrophe, too entangled in a history that had the power to consume him. The discovery he had made was not simply dangerous. It was a threat that extended far beyond his own life. And now, whether he liked it or not, it had become his responsibility. Jerome's footsteps echoed with an urgency he had not felt before as he left the cavernous chamber behind. The sight of the endless crates and the rusting shells had burned itself into his mind, and now every sound seemed louder, every drip of water sharper, every shifting shadow more threatening. The knowledge of what he had seen weighed on him like a physical burden. He had stumbled into a cache of destruction, a graveyard of weapons that time had not neutralized but only made more unstable. Each breath of the stale, chemical-tinged air reminded him that this was no place for a living man. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to push back through the corridors and fight his way to the surface before it was too late. But fear slowed him as much as it urged him forward, because every step carried risk. The mountain seemed to breathe around him, its walls groaning faintly as if warning him of its fragility. He imagined the chain reaction that could erupt if even a single shell crumbled under pressure, imagined the shock wave tearing through stone, snow, and sky. He could picture the mountain erupting, not with lava or fire from the earth, but with the pent-up violence of a war that had never ended. And he was alone, utterly alone, in the heart of it. He tightened his grip on the lamp, forcing himself to keep moving, his boots slipping on patches of moisture that had frozen into thin sheets of ice. The corridor stretched endlessly, and though he knew he was retracing his steps, he felt as though the mountain had rearranged itself, lengthening the path to keep him prisoner. His breath grew ragged, and he paused to press a hand to the wall, its damp surface grounding him in the moment. He had to stay calm, he told himself, had to conserve his energy. Panic would serve only the silence that already sought to swallow him whole. The thought of the world outside gave him strength. He imagined the blinding white of the snowfields, the sting of cold air rushing into his lungs, the sound of wind sweeping across the peaks. He clung to that vision, using it as a beacon to guide him through the suffocating dark. Yet, with each step, a deeper question gnawed at him. What was he to do with the knowledge of what he had seen? To leave it behind, to walk away in silence, felt impossible. That arsenal was not a relic to be ignored. It was a disaster waiting to happen, a catastrophe hidden beneath the snow, threatening anyone who lived in the valleys below. He had uncovered a secret, and now that secret demanded responsibility. The slope of the corridor shifted upward, and Jerome felt his muscles strain as he climbed. His lamp flickered, sputtering for a moment, and his chest clenched in fear that the light would abandon him. In that instant of dimness, the darkness pressed against him like a living thing, vast and impenetrable. But the beam steadied, and he exhaled slowly, whispering a silent promise to himself. He would get out. He would not let the mountain keep him. He thought of his family, of the city he had left behind, of the countless lives and villages scattered across the slopes. None of them knew that their existence balanced on the brittle edges of rusting bombs. He would not let this place remain hidden. As he neared the corridor where the archives had been, a low rumble shook through the walls. Jerome froze, his heart hammering, eyes darting across the ceiling. Dust drifted down in fine streams, settling on his shoulders. The sound faded, leaving silence thicker than before. The mountain had shifted, reminding him that its patience was limited. Every second he lingered was borrowed time. He pressed on, his pace quickening, his breath echoing as though the walls themselves mocked his desperation. At last he reached the chamber where the first equipment lay scattered, where the broken generator and torn fabric still marked the passage of men long gone. He remembered the awe he had felt upon seeing those signs of human presence, the chill of knowing he was not the first to walk here. But awe had turned to urgency. He glanced at the remnants briefly, then moved on without pause. The archives, the posters, the maps, he left them untouched, resisting the temptation to linger. Their secrets would be for others to study with safety and expertise. His task was no longer discovery, but escape. The passageway narrowed again, and he felt the slope steepen beneath his boots. His lamp illuminated the final stretch towards the great outer door, and relief surged through him so strongly that his knees trembled. But the sight that greeted him sent a fresh wave of dread washing over his relief. The snow outside had shifted since his entry. A collapse of ice and rock had partially blocked the doorway, spilling into the corridor with jagged slabs and mounds of frozen debris. The gap was small, barely wide enough to crawl through, and unstable enough to threaten further collapse. Jerome stood motionless, staring at the blockage, his breath loud in his ears. For a moment, despair rose in him, cold and absolute. To have come so far only to be trapped was almost unbearable. Yet he clenched his jaw, shoving the fear down. He would not die in this place. He had not come this close to freedom to surrender now. Dropping his lamp to the ground to free both hands, he knelt and began clawing at the snow and ice, breaking apart smaller chunks and pushing them aside. The work was slow, each movement sending vibrations through the unstable mound, each sound of shifting stone making his heart lurch. Time lost meaning as he dug, his gloves soaked through, his fingers numb. His breath fogged and froze in the still air, his body screaming for rest. But little by little the gap widened, and the pale glimmer of daylight seeped through. That light gave him strength, the promise of survival guiding his every motion. At last he forced his shoulders into the opening, wriggling forward like an animal fighting for its burrow. Snow scraped against his jacket, pressed against his ribs, filled his collar, but he pushed harder, teeth gritted, until suddenly he burst through, tumbling into the open air. The sky above was gray and vast, the wind rushing across the peaks. Jerome lay on his back in the snow, gasping, his chest heaving, tears stinging his eyes not from grief but from the overwhelming release of tension. He rolled onto his side, pulling himself up, and looked back at the doorway. The massive slab of metal loomed half-hidden beneath snow, its edges still visible, a grim reminder of what lay within. He felt no triumph, only the heavy weight of responsibility pressing even harder now that he stood beneath the open sky. He pulled off a glove with shaking fingers and fumbled for his phone, praying for a signal. The device flickered to life, the bars weak but present. Relief surged through him as he dialed the emergency number, his voice trembling as he spoke to the dispatcher. He struggled to find words to describe what he had seen, his explanations fractured, his sentences broken by shivers and gasps. But the urgency in his tone was unmistakable, and they promised to send help immediately. He ended the call and sat in the snow, the silence of the mountains pressing around him. He was no longer alone, not truly. Somewhere down in the valleys, people now knew of the hidden threat, and soon others would climb to see what he had seen. But the knowledge did not bring him peace. He stared at the doorway, snow swirling across its surface, and felt the unease deepen. He had escaped, but the mountain's secret remained, and now it would no longer belong to silence. It would belong to the world, with all the consequences that might follow. Jerome drew his knees to his chest, resting his forehead against them, trying to calm the storm inside him. He had made his choice, and there was no undoing it. He had decided not only to save himself, but to reveal what he had found. He thought of the families in the valleys, of the skiers who would pass these slopes in ignorance, of the generations who had lived without knowing that a graveyard of weapons slept above their homes. His discovery had changed that forever. The mountain had been forced to surrender its secret, and the world would never look at it the same way again. When the first distant sound of helicopters began to echo across the peaks, Jerome lifted his head and watched the sky. Rescue was coming, but it would not feel like rescue alone. It would feel like the beginning of something larger, something that would ripple far beyond his own life. He rose unsteadily to his feet, brushing snow from his jacket, and turned once more to the dark outline of the door. The decision had been made, and the path ahead was no longer his alone to walk. The mountain would now speak to all who came to listen, and its voice would be one of warning, danger, and history resurrected. The wind battered Jerome's face as he stood on the slope above the hidden door, the snow sweeping in long, restless waves that hissed across the surface of the mountain. He wrapped his arms tighter around himself, his body aching from the fall, the digging, and the desperate crawl to freedom. His heart still beat with the uneven rhythm of survival, each pulse reminding him how close he had been to never seeing daylight again. The door behind him seemed less like an artifact now, and more like a predator, something vast and patient, lying in wait beneath the mountain. He could not take his eyes off it, even as the faint thrum of helicopters drew nearer, their blades chopping the silence into fragments. The sky darkened with the approach of machines, and within minutes figures appeared above the ridge, silhouettes and heavy gear descending with ropes and precision. The first rescuers reached him quickly, their voices muffled by masks and the roar of the rotors above. One of them gripped his shoulder firmly, guiding him toward a flatter patch of snow, while others moved directly to the doorway, their bodies purposeful, their movements rehearsed. Jerome tried to speak, to explain, but his words stumbled out in broken fragments. They nodded with sharp understanding, and in that moment he realized that whatever questions he had, These men and women already knew the weight of such discoveries. They brought more light than he had carried, powerful beams that cut through the snow and pressed into the black slit of the doorway. Within minutes, engineers and military personnel arrived, their vehicles grinding to a halt on the plateau, equipment spilling out onto the ice. Jerome stood back, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown over his shoulders, watching as the professionals advanced into the space that had nearly swallowed him whole. For the first time since he had fallen on that slope, he was not alone, but the feeling of solitude did not leave him. The others were not tourists or wanderers. They were men and women prepared for danger, stepping into the abyss without hesitation. He watched as they pushed the door wider, the groan of metal echoing once more, followed by the dim outline of figures disappearing inside. He turned away, unable to bear looking for long, his mind filling the darkness with images he had already seen. The crates, the shells, the cracked cylinders seeping their frozen stains into the stone. He knew they would find it all, every remnant of war preserved like some grotesque museum curated by time and silence. What unsettled him most was not the thought of them confirming his discovery, but the thought of what would come after. The mountain's secret was no longer his alone. It belonged to the world now, and the world would not look at it with the same fearful awe he had. Hours seemed to pass as he waited, though the sun had barely shifted in the gray sky. He watched the horizon, where distant villages clung to valleys, their chimneys releasing thin curls of smoke into the cold air. Those villages had no idea that death had been sleeping above them all these years. Children played in streets, families cooked their meals, skiers carved through snow, all without knowing that one spark could have changed their lives forever. He wondered if it was better that they had lived in ignorance, that the burden of knowledge had rested unseen in the mountain until now. Yet, he also knew that silence had limits. Sooner or later, secrets demanded to be uncovered, and fate had chosen him as its instrument. When the first group of specialists emerged from the darkness, their faces were grim beneath their helmets. They spoke quickly into radios, summoning more equipment, more caution. Jerome saw the change ripple through their ranks, the easy discipline of arrival replaced by the tightened urgency of men and women who understood they stood on the edge of catastrophe. Vehicles moved into position, heavy crates were unloaded, and the slope that had once been silent was transformed into a staging ground of tense preparation. Jerome approached one of the officers, his voice still hoarse, asking what would happen now. The officer's reply was simple but heavy. The area would be evacuated immediately. Villages below would be cleared, roads closed, ski trails abandoned. Bomb disposal teams would work for weeks, maybe months, dismantling what the war had left behind. The danger was not small. Each shell, each crate carried the weight of time, corrosion, and instability. The work would be slow, precise, and unrelenting. Jerome listened, his stomach hollow, realizing that his discovery had not ended with his escape. It had only begun. As the helicopters lifted again, carrying messages down the mountain to the valleys, Jerome stood apart, watching the soldiers and engineers move like ants across the snow. He thought of the generations who had come before him, who had lived their lives in peace, never knowing that above their heads an arsenal of death had been entombed. He thought of the men who had built it, their intentions steeped in a war that consumed the world, their voices silenced, but their work lingering in the earth like poison waiting to spread. He thought of himself, a man who had come seeking solitude and instead uncovered a truth that no one had asked him to find. That night, he remained under guard at the base of the mountain, wrapped in warmth but unable to sleep. The images replayed endlessly. The endless crates, the fractured shells, the propaganda posters shouting from the walls. He knew that historians would study this place, journalists would write of it, governments would argue over it. For some, it would be a treasure of knowledge, for others a nightmare resurrected. For him, it would always be a memory carved too deeply to fade, the silence of the mountain forever changed by the echo of his footsteps. Days later, when the story broke across the world, Jerome's name was mentioned briefly in headlines, the skier who had stumbled onto a relic of destruction. But the coverage soon shifted to the larger narrative, the sheer scale of the discovery, the danger averted, the process of dismantling. He watched it all from a distance, both grateful and uneasy. Grateful that the world now knew, uneasy because he feared knowledge might tempt curiosity, and curiosity might one day awaken forces better left sleeping. Standing once more on the ridge weeks later, allowed to return only under supervision, Jerome looked at the sealed entrance now guarded by barriers and machines. The mountain no longer seemed to belong to him, no longer a place of freedom or solitude. It had become a monument, a warning carved into ice and stone. He realized with a quiet heaviness that some places carry more than beauty. Some carry the weight of choices made long ago, choices that outlive those who made them, choices that lie in wait until someone stumbles upon their shadow. Jerome strapped his skis to his boots again, feeling the familiar pull of gravity, the call of snow beneath him. He descended carefully this time, not for sport, not for escape, but for reflection. The mountains were no longer only peaks of silence and purity. They were guardians, keepers of secrets that humans had tried to bury. He carried with him the understanding that history is never gone, only hidden, waiting for chance to bring it into the light. And as he moved down the slope, leaving the guarded door behind him, he knew that his life had been bound forever to that discovery, that he would always be the man who forced the mountain to reveal its darkest secret. The snow sprayed in arcs around him as he descended, the air cutting sharp against his face. But the freedom he once sought was gone. In its place was something deeper, something heavier. The knowledge that beneath beauty there can lie ruin, that silence can conceal threats as easily as peace. And though the world would remember the mountain for its hidden arsenal, Jerome would remember it as the place where solitude ended and responsibility began. The secret had been unearthed, and though the danger was being dismantled piece by piece, he knew the truth of it would remain forever, echoing in the cold chambers of the earth and in the chambers of his heart. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss another shocking story. Watch our other videos right now for more unbelievable discoveries and hidden secrets. And if this story left you speechless, share it with your friends. Let them see what's been uncovered